Welcome to Everything with Everett. This is a talk show podcast hosted by Everett McConaughey. The purpose of this production is to share thoughts, voices, and information to further a discussion on who we are as individuals, communities, and a global society. Everything with Everett is open to all topics of discussion: faith, science, history, finances, social issues, and, well, everything. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Visit everettpodcast.com for all the details.
Attention. For security reasons, please maintain close control of your belongings at all times. In order to prevent transporting dangerous items without your knowledge, do not accept luggage, packages, or carry-on items that do not belong to you. Unattended baggage will be removed immediately and may be damaged or destroyed.
Okay, now boarding group 4 passenger, group 4.
Ah, the joys of traveling in the airport. If you're like me, you no doubt remember flying before 9/11, when you could just go to the gate and meet your relatives that were coming in from California. You know, go all the way up to the gate, meet them with flowers. Now you sort of can do that, finally, with gate passes issued by the airline, but still they need to know who you are, what day you plan to come, why you're there, and provide you with a pass at least a day in advance. No showing up, 10 minutes before grandma arrives and greeting her at the gate. So today I want to go over the history of airport security from 1960 through 2000, and my oh my, have we come a long ways. Now, mind you, flying wasn't discovered. I want to say invented. It was invented. Obviously, the Wright brothers built a plane. They had to create a device to fly, but we didn't also understand the science of flying. So it was a discovery and a creation all around 1900. So, we went a good 60 years of no real thought to these airplanes, this novelty being used as a weapon or a means of forcing public discourse. So before the 1960s, there was largely no formal security. The experience of flying resembled public transit. No ID, no checkpoints. Anyone could walk up to the gates. Screening was nearly non-existent. This key trigger changed with early hijackings and bombings, and that showed planes were vulnerable and unauthorized access to sabotage. In the early 1960s, there was a hijacking wave and government response. I'm going to play a video clip for you. It's a few minutes long about some key hijacking events during this time. But some dates and time frames to kind of go over with you. In 1961, the first major U.S. hijacking, the Antulio Ramirez Ortiz hijacks a flight to Cuba. President Kennedy orders armed border patrol on high-risk flights. Hijacking is made a felony punishable by death. That source was Wikipedia. All this information was also compiled largely by AI search engines, because no one source is complete with all of the details that I was looking for. In the mid-1960s, the FAA peace officers and sky marshals were introduced on selected flights, mainly from Miami in 1969. Because at that point, planes were hijacked and flown to Cuba as bartering chips, because that was the big thing, was communism and Cuba and America. that was it. That was the tool that planes were used in hijackings for. And then it evolved once it became clear you could do more with a hijacked airplane. In 1970, July 17th, New Orleans International became the first U.S. airport to install walk-through metal detectors and passenger profiling. So, looking to see odd behavior, things that don't look right. So, going to YouTube, video entitled "What Happened During the Golden Age of Hijackings" from the channel Weird History. It's about 12 minutes long. I fast forwarded 10 seconds, so give or take 12 minutes, more like 11 something. But you can skip forward that time if you don't want to hear it. Otherwise, if you'd like to see the visuals and like the channel, like the video, feel free to click on the link in the podcast episode notes and description down below. Here you go.
In the early 1970s, hijackings of flights originating from the U.S. were, quite literally, out of control. When the U.S. government passed the Anti-Hijacking Act of 1974, it was a direct response to what is now sometimes called the Golden Age of skyjackings. In fact, between 1960 and 1974, there were 240 hijackings, or attempted hijackings, between the U.S. and Cuba alone. So, today, we're going to take a look at the Golden Age of plane hijackings. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other aviation-related topics you would like to hear about. Now, if you look at the center of your screen, you'll notice this Weird History explainer video. On May 1st, 1961, Antuilio Ramirez Ortez took over the cockpit of a National Airlines flight on its way to Key West, Florida. He had a gun and a knife, and he demanded to be taken to Cuba so he could warn Fidel Castro of an assassination plot against him. Ortez said he was a Castro loyalist who left Cuba looking for work, but now wanted to return to his native land. When the plane arrived in Cuba, Castro returned it, the crew, and the other passengers within a day. Ortez stayed in Cuba. 2 years later, Ortez tried to leave again. However, this time he was arrested, and in 1965 he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for espionage. When he got out of prison, he tried to leave yet again and wound up spending another 3 years in prison in the early 1970s. He finally made it out of Cuba again in 1975. His triumph was short-lived, however, because he was immediately arrested for the 1961 hijacking upon arrival in the U.S. He spent 4 years in prison in the U.S. Although it's hard to believe now, at the time of Ortez's hijacking, the U.S. had no official policies regarding air piracy. So instead, he was charged with assault and transporting a stolen aircraft across state lines. The late 1960s and early 1970s were characterized by an epidemic of hijackings, and most of the planes were taken in the U.S. and then redirected to Cuba. The reasons for these hijackings varied widely, with the perpetrators wanting everything from being able to study communism to getting some decent frijoles. That's not a bad joke. Seriously, a guy hijacked an airplane for frijoles. Hijacking for pizza, yeah, I get. Frijoles, that's more of jaywalking. The U.S. Congress decided to take action and, as a result of Senate hearings, the Federal Aviation Administration set up a task force to explore counter-hijacking techniques. Previously, pilots had been given guns, but obviously that wasn't too effective. Now, operating under the theory that the best offense would be a good defense, the government mandated that airline passengers were to be sent through metal detectors. Additionally, the first hijacker profile was established. If there's one thing the world has learned from social media and internet comments, it's that everyone thinks they're an expert on everything. So when hijackings became a problem and the FAA decided they wanted to take action, you can bet your house the average airline passenger had a few ideas on what should be done, and they weren't afraid to say so. Passengers, understandably, wanted to protect themselves, so they chimed in and offered suggestions ranging from cartoonishly impractical booby traps to screening processes rooted in bigoted paranoia. Some of the more memorable examples of passenger suggestions included installing trapdoors outside cockpits, arming stewardesses with tranquilizer darts, and playing the Cuban national anthem before takeoff, and then arresting anyone who knew the lyrics. Lucky for everyone, the FAA decided to listen to the experts. Although it may not be the most exciting or gratifying strategy, simply giving in to an armed skyjacker's demands was the safest, most practical option for airline pilots. So that's what they were told to do. Cockpits were equipped with maps of the Caribbean. Pilots were told about the landing facilities at Havana's Jose Marti International Airport, and they were given cards with rudimentary Spanish so they could communicate with any potential hijacker. An official Cuba hijack phone line was installed at Miami Air Traffic Control, and the Swiss, who were the U.S.'s diplomatic intermediaries, created a form that could be used to request the return of planes. Castro, for his part, was really more interested in embarrassing the U.S. than anything else, so most of the planes were eventually returned, albeit with a heavy fee attached. Rafael Minichiello skyjacked a flight in October of 1969, one that had several stop-offs before reaching its final destination. He flew from Los Angeles to San Francisco, where he hijacked a plane and demanded to be taken to New York. That guy's racking up the miles. The plane stopped in Denver, and the passengers were released. After refueling in New York, FBI agents tried to keep Minichiello from taking off again. Born in Italy, Minichiello wanted to go home, and after firing his gun, was allowed to continue on a flight to Rome. He escaped capture when he landed in Rome, but was later tracked down by police and taken into custody. Italy refused to extradite him and tried him in Rome instead. His actions woke up FAA and FBI officials as well as hijackers to the possibility of taking flights to a location other than Cuba, which was something they had never really considered for no reason other than it had almost never come up before. So why was Minichiello so mad? What drove him to do it? Well, he said he was shorted $200 in one of his paychecks as a U.S. Marine. You guys, don't rip off a Marine. Most of the planes hijacked in the late 1960s and early 1970s were relatively small, carrying about 100 passengers on average. In 1973, however, when a hijacker identified as R. Campos commandeered American Airlines Flight 299 from New York to San Juan, he took a plane with 379 passengers on board to Cuba. The plane landed safely in Cuba and was greeted by Fidel Castro himself. Castro chatted with the pilot, Captain Augustus Watkins, and inspected the 747 while assuring him that the plane would be able to take off, despite its size and a lack of appropriate runway space at the Cuban airport. What can't Castro do? The plane did take off shortly after landing and made its way to Miami. After FBI agents debriefed Watkins, the 747 departed for San Juan, arriving only about 7 hours late. Most all hijackers up until this point had been men, but not all hijackers are men. Take Catherine Marie Kirkow, who along with fellow Black Panther Roger Holder hijacked Western Airlines Flight 701 from Los Angeles to Seattle by claiming to have a bomb. They demanded $500,000 and let the plane land in San Francisco. Once on the ground, Kirkow and her colleague boarded a plane to Algeria, where they were granted asylum. Not cool, Algeria. She was charged with air piracy by a federal court in 1972, and a warrant was issued for her arrest. In 1975, the two were arrested for trying to illegally enter France. They were found guilty and fined, and they were released but not allowed to leave Paris. Kirkow, however, left. Holder was extradited to the U.S., but Kirkow's whereabouts are unknown. She remains on the most wanted list for domestic terrorism. After hijacking a Pan American flight headed to Puerto Rico in 1968, Luis Armando Peña Soltrin spent over 40 years in Cuba. According to accounts, Soltrin and two accomplices stormed the cockpit with weapons he snuck on the flight in a diaper bag. His fellow hijackers were arrested and sent back to prison in the U.S., but Soltrin was protected, and he had a long tenure as a fugitive in Cuba before returning to the U.S. in 2009. However, the U.S. doesn't forget hijackers, and upon his return in 2011, he faced air piracy and kidnapping charges and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. In 1972, 3 criminals hijacked a plane in Birmingham, Alabama, shortly after it took off. They ordered the pilot to fly around the country for a while and demanded a $10 million ransom. At one point, they even threatened to have the plane crash into the nuclear facility at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Despite the bluster, however, the affair eventually ended, thankfully, without a nuclear explosion. But the incident wasn't completely bloodless either. The first officer was shot, and 31 passengers were held hostage for 29 hours. In 1974, Samuel Bike hijacked a Delta Airlines flight leaving Baltimore, Maryland, and he had big plans. Namely, to crash the plane into the White House. Bike had a gun and a bomb on board. When he got to the cockpit of the plane, he shot both the co-pilot and the pilot, killing the first and injuring the latter. Thanks to the unsmart thinking of taking out the pilot, Bike never got the plane off of the ground. Then a police officer pursued him, who shot him while he was still in the plane. Accounts vary as to whether or not the cop killed Bike or merely wounded him before Bike took his own life. Bike didn't get to carry his plan out, but he did leave his mark on pop culture. He's a character in Stephen Sondheim's and John Weidman's 1991 musical Assassins. And he was portrayed by Sean Penn in the 2004 film The Assassination of Richard Nixon. He's even alleged to be one of the inspirations for the character Travis Bickle, who was played by Robert De Niro in the 1976 hit film Taxi Driver. Possibly the most famous jacker of all time was the enigmatic Dan Cooper, who, through a mistake propagated by the mass media, became known to the world as D.B. Cooper. Cooper, whoever he may have been, famously hijacked a Northwest Airlines flight in 1971 over Washington state. After the flight landed in Seattle, authorities delivered him $200,000, as well as several parachutes. He demanded to be taken to Mexico, and the plane took off again. While heading south, Cooper parachuted out of the plane, never to be seen again. While the FBI believes Cooper likely couldn't have survived his jump given the weather conditions and gear he was wearing, there are, nonetheless, lots of theories about what happened to him. There have been no traces of Cooper himself since the hijacking. However, in 1980, 3 packets of Cooper's ransom money were discovered in a sandy riverbank of the Columbia River. And in 2017, authorities found what they thought was a strap from his parachute in the Pacific Northwest. As the 1970s wore on, airplane hijackings became more brazen, more global, and more extortionist. Threatening passengers' lives for money and then using the planes to escape were the preferred methods of skyjacking. To end the situation once and for all, the FBI began sending snipers to tarmacs, and plainclothes agents began boarding planes. Finally, on January 5, 1973, all passengers began being screened. While this didn't put an end to hijackings, it did put an end to the frequent occurrences that constituted the golden age of hijackings. So what do you think? Do you feel safe on airplanes in modern times? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.
Interesting context there of all the different, hijacking events, and certainly there's a lot more that's taken place than we really, I think, are consciously aware of in today's increasing fast-paced news and terror, and just, those were unheard of events back in the day. And now it's like, we have school shootings happening all the time. So we're a little bit more hardened to these events of terror and drama. So jumping back on the timeline, I had kind of bounced around a little bit. Let me find this other timeline. There's so many points, and didn't want to be too detailed, but I didn't want to be too short. So just to summarize again, from before the 1960s, again, no formal security. The experience of flying resembled public transit, no ID, no checkpoints. Anyone could walk up to the gates. Screening was nearly non-existent, primarily staffed by civilian police protecting against theft and vandalism. That was all they really cared about at the airports. In the early 1960s, hijacking waves an initial government response. 1961, the major hijacking, and Tulio Ortiz to Cuba. President Kennedy ordered the armed border patrol on high-risk flights, and hijacking was made a felony punishable by death. In the 1960s, FAA peace officers and sky marshals introduced on selected flights. Example given is in Miami, 1969. And obviously that video that we just listened to covered the 1968 through 1972, quote, golden age of hijacking, where U.S. commercial jets were hijacked over 130 times, often weekly, frequently for political statements or asylum demands, especially to Cuba. And in response to all that, the FAA forms an anti-hijacking task force and develops a hijacker psychological profile. July 17th, 1970, New Orleans International becomes the first U.S. airport to install walk-through metal detectors and passenger profiling. In 1970, Eastern Airlines Flight 1320 was the first U.S. hijacking fatality. The security shift took place. It prompts broader concern and leads to initial voluntary passenger screenings. 1970 through 1974, mandatory universal screening and international treaties. September 1970, Dawson's Field hijacking. Coordinated hijackings of multiple aircraft by the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, shook the global public. A security shift took place, forces aviation regulators to formalize passenger profiling, baggage screening, and metal detector requirements globally. It marks a turning point in treating skyjacking as terrorism. In November 1972, hijackers threatened to crash Southern Airways Flight 49 into a nuclear facility. A security shift, the FAA, the FAA issues emergency rule, all passengers and carry-on baggage to be screened. January 1973 to 1974, the FAA mandates universal screening. In 1974, Congress codifies into law via Air Transportation Security Act, requiring metal detectors and X-ray inspection for all carry-on baggage. Bomb-sniffing dogs are also deployed from 1972. In 1963 to 1971, ICAO conventions, Tokyo, Hague, and Montreal. International standards against hijacking and sabotage are set. 1972, United States versus Epperson, EPPERSON. Courts uphold the legitimacy of profiling and metal detector requirements, laying legal groundwork. So I have another video for you. This one is only a minute and a half. It is from the History Academy YouTube channel, posted 2 years ago, and it is entitled Dawson's Field Hijackings 1970.
While dynamite was put aboard the planes, the guerrilla guards stood over them to prevent King Hussein's troops getting too close. 15 minutes later, the commandos themselves left in a hurry. Then, just before 3 o'clock, it happened. Hassan Dalal was the only cameraman allowed to remain. We asked him how he knew when to start his camera. He said, as soon as I saw the commandos running. Dalal was only 300 yards away when the first plane, the BOAC VC-10, went up. Next to go was the Transworld Airlines Boeing 707, but its death throes were masked by the pool of smoke from the burning VC-10. You'll see the explosion in a moment in the middle of that smoke. Together, the planes were worth close on £10 million. One of the leaders of the group that had blown them up was asked why they did it, with still 10 or more hours left before their deadline expired. He said, "It became clear to us that there was a plan by imperialist forces to seize the planes. That's why we did it."
So as you can tell, in the 1970s, grabbing a plane becomes like grabbing a microphone. on the world stage and kind of getting your demands met. Your 15 minutes of the limelight, as they would say. So as the other video before that one mentioned, the D.B. Cooper hijacking between Portland and Seattle, kind of a long unsolved mystery. Was it an inside job, as some people say? Was it, did this person truly just understand the wilderness and lived out his days in hiding? Why did he need the money? Did he die falling from that height? All kinds of stuff. So here's another interesting video that I found. It's 9 minutes and 35 seconds long. If you want to, again, skip it, fast forward, feel free. Link to the video is in the podcast description. Again, all these videos are in the description. Title of the video, just click it. It should be a URL. It'll take you to the YouTube channel that I am playing it from, and you can enjoy and support that content creator yourself.
November 24th, 1971, Portland International Airport. A man named Dan Cooper boards Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 to Seattle.
The flight crew and the passengers describe him as an unremarkable guy. He's a Caucasian male, he's got on a dark suit, black tie, carrying a briefcase.
He's one of the last to board the plane, sits in the last row in 18E. He orders a bourbon and soda and dons a pair of sunglasses.
The plane takes off at 2:50 p.m.
The flight from Portland to Seattle is a milk run, flown several times a day. It's about an hour in the air. This time around, the plane's carrying 36 passengers and 6 crew members.
Everything's going to plan. Everything's on schedule. Until the man seated in the last row, Cooper, hands a note to the flight attendant, Florence Schaffner. She doesn't read it at first. She puts it in her pocket, and then Cooper says to her, "You might want to read that."
The note says, "I have a bomb, and I'd like you to sit next to me." Florence Schaffner understandably sort of loses it, but she does comply and follows his instructions.
Cooper opens his briefcase, revealing a makeshift bomb.
Schaffner describes the contents of the briefcase as something that looks like 8 sticks of dynamite, a battery, and a bunch of wires.
Cooper has her attention. She knows he's serious. He demands 4 parachutes and a ransom of $200,000 when the plane lands in Seattle.
Schaffner relays the hijacker's commands to Captain William Scott. But since it's such a short flight, ground forces need more time to react.
So air traffic control keeps the plane circling around for 2 hours until they can gather the money in the parachutes.
Investigators write down the serial number of every bill and then bundle it up into a bank bag.
The plane finally lands in Seattle at 5:46 p.m.
Captain Scott parks the plane away from the building. Cooper sends out a different flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, and she goes out and interacts with the authorities. There, she collects the money and the parachutes and returns to the plane. She also brings printed instructions on how to use the parachutes, but Cooper tells her he does not need them.
Cooper agrees to let the passengers off the plane. 2 flight attendants, Florence Schaffner and Alice Hancock, also ask to leave, and Cooper allows them to.
But the ordeal isn't over for the rest of the crew.
Cooper wants the 727 to take off again and start to head towards Mexico City. He's going to keep the 4 remaining crew members as hostages: the flight attendant, the flight engineer, the first officer, and the captain.
For this second flight, Cooper makes more demands.
Cooper wants the pilots to fly with the wing flaps in an unusual configuration, a downward position. Now that's how a plane normally takes off, but then they raise the flaps. You wouldn't fly long haul with the flaps down because it creates enormous drag and means it can't go very fast, something like 200 miles per hour.
Cooper also asks that they keep the landing gear down and fly below 10,000 feet. He wants them to be going super slow and super low.
The pilots tell Cooper it can't be done. They're afraid the plane might just fall out of the sky. But the hijacker is adamant that it will work, and they need to comply.
At 7:40 p.m., the plane takes off for Mexico City. But 20 minutes into the flight, Cooper does something completely unexpected.
He lowers the plane's rear air stair. The 727 has a set of stairs that can be lowered out of the back of the airplane. The pilot gets a warning light when this happens.
Once Cooper lowers the aft stairs around 8 p.m., he puts on his parachute, grabs his $200,000, and jumps out.
The hijacker is never seen again.
At 11:02 p.m., the pilot safely lands the plane in Reno. At this point, the flight crew has stayed in the cockpit, and they're not sure if Cooper is still in the plane or not. But when the FBI searches the plane, Cooper is definitely gone.
Almost immediately, the story spreads like wildfire.
D.B. Cooper bailed out of a Northwest Airlines jet going 200 miles an hour at about 10,000 feet. The best guess is he jumped almost exactly over La Center, Washington.
The FBI takes the lead on the case, with assistance from sheriffs and state troopers in Washington, Oregon, and Nevada.
They have very little to go on. This guy has committed an incredibly well-planned crime.
Authorities need to begin somewhere. They start with his name.
They know he bought a ticket under the name Dan Cooper.
The FBI doesn't really suspect that's his real name, but criminals often choose an alias that's very close to their real name.
So they run this idea by the Portland police, and as luck would have it, they know of a petty criminal who goes by D.B. Cooper.
D.B. Cooper lives about an hour and a half from Portland, in the Dalles, Oregon.
And he's got a minor record, so police have him in the system.
It's a long shot, but they know they have to start somewhere. And they're hopeful they can nab him on his way home with $200,000 of stolen money.
A police officer drives to D.B. Cooper's house the night of the hijacking, planning to stake it out until Cooper comes home and catch him red-handed.
But as soon as the officer arrives, he sees Cooper's already home.
It seems unreasonable that D.B. Cooper would have committed the skyjacking, jumped out of the plane, and made it back home to his house in the Dalles that night.
The timeline doesn't fit in any way, shape, or form. So despite having a similar name and a criminal record, D.B. Cooper is quickly ruled out as the hijacker.
Meanwhile, at Reno Airport, authorities race to gather evidence on the plane.
Inside the plane, FBI agents find 66 latent fingerprints, but can't identify any of them. They also find Cooper's black clip-on tie and tie clip, some cigarette butts, and 2 of the 4 parachutes. That's it. That's all they have.
In 1971, we don't have fingerprint databases like we do today. We also don't have DNA at this time.
The tie clip and the tie are pretty unremarkable, so they're going to be hard to trace. There's nothing on the plane that immediately tells us who the hijacker is.
With little to go on, a large-scale manhunt begins.
The FBI knows that he jumped out of the plane somewhere between Seattle and Reno, and now they need to know where to look. But it's hard to determine Cooper's landing zone because they don't know exactly when and where he jumped. There's so many variables involved. What was the wind speed? When did he pull the ripcord? When and where was the plane exactly when he jumped?
It's next to impossible to establish an accurate search area, but they start with a massive section of really thick forest north of Portland.
This is a huge deal. The Air Force actually loans them an SR-71 Blackbird to help them photograph the entire flight area in hopes of developing a clue.
Though the Blackbird retraces the hijacked plane's flight path 5 times, their search turns up empty.
The Oregon National Guard brings out helicopters to search for Cooper. They find some plastic and broken tree limbs, but it turns out it has nothing to do with the crime.
And then 200 U.S. Army soldiers searched the forest on foot.
There's also a private salvage company that searched Lake Merwin with a submarine looking for evidence of Cooper at the bottom of the lake. They don't find anything.
Despite all this effort, no trace of Cooper is found.
People don't just disappear. He has to be somewhere. The FBI wants to get his face out to the public, hoping someone has seen him.
With no actual photo to go on, the FBI enlists the help of a sketch artist.
They talk to people who were at the Portland airport, who saw him buy his ticket, and people who were on the airplane. Both sets of witnesses give a near identical description of the man.
He's a Caucasian man in his mid-40s with a somewhat dark olive complexion. He has a receding hairline, short dark hair, and is wearing a dark suit and sunglasses.
This sketch, which has become world famous, comes out about a week after the hijacking on November 28, 1971. It generates hundreds, if not thousands, of tips.
You have to understand, D.B. Cooper almost becomes a legend. There's kind of a Cooper mania surrounding him. He's kind of like a Jesse James or a Billy the Kid, this kind of common man who beats the system. And in the 1970s, that's the coolest thing you can do.
Claiming to be D.B. Cooper, especially in the Pacific Northwest, is just a way to get your 15 minutes of fame.
This is a nightmare to these poor investigators because they have to sift through all these false confessions. After a few years, many agents speculate that they will never really find the real Cooper.
The unsolved case continues to captivate the public 5 decades after the skyjacking took place. Perhaps someday one of the many passionate sleuths still investigating this mystery will help us discover D.B. Cooper's real name.
So a link to that video will be in the description below, like I said. Going back to the timeline, pull that up over here. So many tabs. Okay. So Dawson, nuclear facility. Okay, so that is through the 60s and 70s. Obviously, just went over that video. So mid-1970s through 1980s, rising bombing threats and refinements. 1971, D.B. Cooper hijacking security shift leads to the installation of Cooper vane on aircrafts to prevent the opening of aft step ladders in flight. In 1975, LaGuardia Airport in New York was bombed. A bomb in a baggage locker kills 11 and injures 74. A security shift took place. It brings focus on terminal area security and public access controls. In 1985, TWA Flight 847 hijacking in Beirut spurs reinvigoration of Sky Marshal program. Professional agents begin riding undercover on flights. December 1988, Lockerbie Pan Am Flight 103 bombing. A bomb destroys the aircraft over Lockerbie, Scotland, resulting in 270 fatalities. A security shift takes place. It triggers mandatory checked bag screening globally, passenger bag matching, tighter international coordination, and upgrades in baggage tracking and explosive detection systems. In the 1990s, enhancements after the Lockerbie and emerging hijacking bombings. Post-1988, the U.S. passes the Aviation Security Improvement Act of 1990. The security shift took place, mandating the background checks of airline workers, improved training, and investment in explosive detection technology. In February 1993, the World Trade Center bombing. A truck bomb explodes beneath the North Tower, killing 6 and injuring over 1,000. The security shift took place, highlighting the domestic terrorism via explosives and directly influences risk profiling system like CAPS, CAPPS, and wider adoption of CT-based baggage screening. So I'm going to pause right there. We're going to jump back in at 1994. But the next video that I have queued up is 9 minutes and 11 seconds long, and it discusses the, it's a news broadcast from NBC, coverage of the 1993 World Trade Center basement bombing.
Sitting in for Tom is Jane Pauley.
Good evening. You're looking live at the world's second tallest buildings in the heart of New York City's financial district. At this hour, more than 500 rescue workers are there on the scene of a massive underground explosion that ripped through the World Trade Center just after noon today, killing 5, injuring at least 300. NBC's John Miller is there now with late information on the cause of today's explosion. John?
Well, Jane, the United States Department of Justice is operating on the assumption tonight, on the theory that this was the work of terrorist bombers because of the debris and rubble that have collapsed from 2 floors into a sub-basement garage where they believe the blast originated. They have not been able to get bomb squad people down there to find the point of origin. Incidentally, this is the same garage that the United States Secret Service uses to store President Bill Clinton's limousine, the one he uses when he travels to the New York metropolitan area. In the meantime, bomb experts here from the FBI's Joint Terrorist Task Force, New York City Police Department Bomb Squad, and the Treasury are assuming because of the force of this blast, the incredible force, that it could only have been done using some kind of vehicle that could carry hundreds of pounds of explosives, a kind of car bomb, as we've seen in cases in Lebanon. Right now, though, they say because of that rubble, they can't get down there, and it will be not days, but possibly weeks before they can dig their way in and find the point of origin. So they are operating on the assumption that it was a bombing. And of course, there was a call taking credit for this from a group calling it the Serbian Liberation Front, but they cannot verify the veracity of that call because it came in more than an hour after the blast. Jane?
Well, thanks, John. Gary Matsumoto is also there. Gary, what's the scene at this hour? Gary Matsumoto? We don't have communications with Gary Matsumoto. I'm guessing we should try to find NBC's Mike Jensen, who has also been at the scene of today's explosion throughout this afternoon. Mike, are you there?
Jane, I'm here. I've been talking to survivors, people who thought that they would be trapped in the building, and the stories they tell are chilling. New Yorkers like to think they've seen everything, but this was beyond their imagination.
And then somebody screamed, "Get out!" Everyone grabbed their coats and ran.
From his Midtown studio, anchorman Chuck Scarborough talked to people trapped in the giant building, tried to calm them.
Will someone come and get us, please?
We're going to try to help you out, Deborah.
But downtown, it was chaos.
And we just heard boom, and the whole building shook.
A pregnant woman was rescued by helicopter.
What was the worst moment for you?
The worst moment for me was around the 40th floor because my knees just became like jelly. And if it wasn't for the support of my coworkers who kept saying, "You got to keep going," I probably would have just sat there. I said, "Can I rest?"
Did you ever think you might not make it?
Yes, I did.
Charles McAteer was on the 56th floor when the explosion hit.
We went in the 20th floor and we had to get down on our hands and knees and crawl till we got into one of the offices so we could breathe, okay? That time I panicked because it didn't look good at that time.
Outside, rescue workers helped those who had collapsed or were having trouble breathing. Annette Zitron said it was a terrifying experience.
We thought it was an earthquake. That's what we thought, because the building shook and glass started flying, and I just said to my husband, "Run, get out of here." And I knew when we came in where the door was, so we just ran outside, and then I couldn't find my husband, and I thought something happened to him. And then luckily we were reunited.
Carmen Lirio thought she'd never make it out of the building.
I thought I was going to die of the smoke. If I would have been there 2 more minutes with that smoke, I think I would have passed out. It was horrifying. I've never seen anything like it.
Some of the survivors were exposed to asbestos, so they were taken to a special room here at the World Trade Center where they were showered and their clothes were laundered. Jane?
Thanks, Mike. Now let's go to NBC's Gary Matsumoto for a recap of what happened today. Gary?
Jane, at this hour, helicopters are still swarming the World Trade Center. Firefighters are still inside searching for the injured. There are at least 38 people in a triage unit on the 48th floor. There are no plans at this hour to evacuate them. For the estimated 130,000 people who work and visit the World Trade Center every day, darkness fell about 12:15. The explosion blacked out the entire complex. The power is out. There are people still trapped inside in elevators.
Thousands poured out of the building, gasping for air. Eyes glazed with shock, they spoke of the devastation within.
There was no hope whatsoever. Trapped on 94 floors all the way up. Nobody came.
There was smoke, and then the lights went out, and I'd say about 70 floors we had no lights.
Stairwells became smokestacks. Clouds of soot billowed up the stairs to the very top of the 110-story office towers. Some evacuees say they couldn't see their hands outstretched in front of them as they groped their way down to the ground, choking on the smoke.
The walls just blew in, and everything went blank after that. Walls collapsed, furniture's down. It's a mess downstairs.
The explosion blasted a gaping hole through the ceiling of the second sub-basement in Tower Number 1. This is where firefighters say the injuries were most severe. A crowded stop for commuter trains that shuttle workers across the Hudson to New Jersey. The offices just above the area lie in ruin.
It was a heavy smoke condition. A couple of rooms were on fire, and just a tremendous amount of structural damage.
Many workers were plucked from the roof by helicopters swooping down through gusting currents of frigid wind. Determining the source of the blast could prove dangerous. Investigators say there are several floors of rubble flooded by broken water pipes and electrified by exposed wiring. In addition, New York officials fear a possible environmental hazard.
The transformers that are still standing are dry, so that would mean there would be no PCBs or other contaminants. That's a good sign. There is significant indications that there may be an asbestos problem.
As you can see behind me, the streets of the city's financial district are still choked with firefighting equipment. Rescue workers say the operation is expected to continue late into the night. Jane?
Thanks, Gary. Within hours of the explosion, 3 miles north in New York's Manhattan, the Empire State Building, the city's next tallest, was evacuated after a report of an explosive device there. Police called it a precautionary measure. Nothing was found. Today's World Trade Center explosion came awfully close to being every urban resident's nightmare, trapped in a towering high-rise with a single thought, is there a way out? Here's NBC's Stone Phillips.
High-rise buildings enveloped in smoke. Whatever the cause, the reaction is the same: survival.
It was scary. There was nothing. We had no emergency lighting, no nothing. We had nothing.
High-rise fires are the ultimate urban nightmare. They are terrifying and often deadly. 1980, the MGM Grand Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, 85 people killed. 1986, San Juan, Puerto Rico, the DuPont Plaza Hotel, 96 killed. And Mexico City in May 1991, another office building, 17 people dead. High floors, sealed windows, thousands of people to evacuate. And as we saw today, suffocating smoke. Fire safety engineer Bob Benazzi.
Is it just inevitable that smoke is going to rise up through the building as far as it did in this case?
Yes, it is, because in a high-rise building, a stair shaft or any vertical shaft is going to act as a chimney.
If you had one piece of advice to give people caught in a high-rise fire or smoke situation, what would it be?
I guess it would be to sit still and wait to hear what you should do.
Hard advice to follow at moments like this, but today, lives depended on it. Stone Phillips, NBC News, New York.
When Nightly News continues, mammograms for women under 50. Do they really help detect breast cancer? And George Steinbrenner is back in baseball. Can the controversial owner make his Yankees winners again?
It's crazy to hear like those old newscasts and names. We lived in such a more carefree world before 9/11. So jumping back into the timeline, 1994. There we are. 1994, FAA certified CTX 5000 CT scan systems for checked baggage explosive detection are developed. 1995, All Nippon Airways Flight 857 hijacking. The first ever armed law enforcement intervention on a domestic flight in Japan. Security shift raises awareness of the cult-like domestic terrorism and reinforces aircraft crew protection. In 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing and 1996 Olympic bombing in Atlanta, Georgia. A security shift took place along with other domestic and international incidents, intensified the focus on explosive threats. 1997 through 2000, CTX 5000 systems were deployed more broadly in major U.S. airports. August 1998, U.S. embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. Nearly simultaneous truck bombs kill over 200 and injure thousands. Security shift, though not in an airport, significantly alters the aviation threat modeling and pre-screening protocols. In the late 1990s, CAPS-1, CAPPS, It's the Computer-Assisted Passenger Screening System. It was introduced, developed by the FBI and FAA. It uses passenger profile data, name, booking history, and ticket type to flag certain travelers for additional checked bag screening and applies algorithms to assign risk scores. Its role, it allows more targeted scrutiny and it also flagged several 9/11 hijackers for extra checked bag screening, but did not require additional checkpoint frisking, limiting the effectiveness. So it, flagged some of their bags. They checked the bags. It was like, oh, nothing in the bag. But we didn't have any triggers to say, hey, we should check them out at the security checkpoint and maybe we'd find the knives on their body or, tools that they had with their person to hijack and overtake the aircraft on September 11th, 2001. In 1999, All Nippon Airways Flight 61, noticing a trend with that airline, hijacked twice. Probably bad for shareholders. A knife weapon smuggled via security loophole in Tokyo. A security shift took place, results in reforms at Japanese airports, baggage screening tightened, and secure gate access is ensured. By the year 2000, pre-9/11 status, a layered system with gaps was in place. Mandatory security, metal detectors, and X-ray screening at all U.S. airports was standard. Behavioral profiling, augmented by CAPS selection, that's the computer analysis of passenger data. Checked baggage screening using CT explosive detection systems, the CTX 5000, and deployed broadly. Sky Marshals, created by the FAA, were placed on some international and high-risk flights. Physical modifications, Cooper veins, those were those preventions to not opening doors to aircraft while in flight. Intelligence coordination, the national and international agencies share watch lists and alert data. There, at this point in the timeline, again, before 9/11, the remaining gaps in place, onboard security measures like reinforced cockpit doors and full-time air marshals were not yet standard. The layered defense model existed, but had weaknesses, especially in intelligence sharing and in-flight security. And some notable cast of characters. This section lists the principal people mentioned in the resources above, with brief bios based on their text information that was provided. And Tulio Ramirez Ortiz was the individual responsible for the first major U.S. hijacking in 1961, diverting a flight to Cuba. So 1961, hijacking becomes a thing. President Kennedy, U.S. President Kennedy in 1961 responded to the first U.S. hijacking by ordering armed border patrol on high-risk flights and making hijacking a felony punishable by death. D.B. Cooper is a famous hijacker in 1971 whose action led to the installation of Cooper veins on aircraft to prevent opening of the aft stepladders in flight. And Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister in 1988, seen in news footage visiting the crash site of Pan Am Flight 103 after the Lockerbie bombing, capturing the immediate impact of the disaster. And Tokiko Kato, passenger on the All Nippon Airways Flight 857, 1995 hijacking, who helped alert police, contributing to the police raid and subsequent reforms at Japanese airports. So there you have it, as brief and nutshell level overview of airport security from publicly sourced resources via AI searches from 1960 to 2000. And, maybe you think about some of those things that we went over there and think, Ah, yes, that's the event that long ago. That is still relevant today. That's why we do this. That's why we have these security protocols. That's why we go through the metal detector. That's why the bag has to go through the screening X-ray. That's why you have to take the electronics out of your bag to make sure that there's nothing else in the bag, nothing hidden or weird. That's why all your bags that you check with the airline go through screening in the back, out of sight before going onto the plane. It's all because of these events that happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's way before TSA. It's way before Department of Homeland Security. It's way before, President George W. Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and Trump. We've been dealing with this for a long time. My mom's entire life fits within this entire history of airport security. And that's crazy to think about. So in our parents' or grandparents' lifetime, if you're a Gen Zer now, or what is it, Alpha, the people born, if you're in your young 20s and teens now, yes, your grandma was born at the beginning of all this history. My mother. So, anywho, that is, like I said, a nutshell version of the nuts in our airways. Anyway, I hope you have a great one. I'll be back for another part 2 of this airport security look. But obviously we're going to hit on the next chapter. Post 9/11. For another 20 years of information.
Thank you for listening to Everything with Everett. Connect with Everett and other listeners on Facebook and Twitter at Everett Podcast. Everett would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts by emailing mystory@everettpodcast.com. You can also leave a voicemail or send a text message to 208-391-2808. Choose to listen, speak with kindness, and have a great day.